Hi guys and welcome to Studio Wildlife. In this video I'm going to show you how I painted a tiger in pastels, but I thought I'd do it a little bit differently and do it on a wooden panel because I was trying to see if I could create a pastel piece and fix it and seal it and varnish it so it didn't have to be framed behind glass. To do that I'm using this wooden panel and I'm using this golden pastel ground to prime it. This pastel ground is just sort of this paste that has fine particles in it that emulates a pastel paper texture. I then mix that with a little bit of white and black acrylic paint to create this grey ground. I did actually sand back some of the layers. Yeah, don't do that. Don't sand it once you've painted it because it just completely takes away all of that texture that you've just applied with the paste. So do not sand it, just leave it as it is. Then I just traced onto the top a drawing of this tiger that I wanted to do. This one is from Wildlife Reference Photos, and then because I wanted the blacks to be really black, I decided to then start by painting over the top using some acrylic paints. And I'm just using a flat brush and some black acrylic paint just to block in the basic shapes, the basic dark structures and the stripes of the tiger. Then I just did a quick wash with some burnt umber mixed with a little bit of the black, and just to put down that base colour, which will make it easier for using the pastels over the top, also I thought anyway. Once I'd let that dry, I started to work on the eyes, and I was using the pastels, starting with some Reeves hard pastels. And I was just using a little bit of yellow ochre first, and just blending it into the wood with my finger. I then worked over the top with a little bit of brown and some black. I am only using very few colours for the pastels because I left my pastel kit in my car and I didn't have access to all the colours that I'd usually use, so I only have about 12 colours to work with. So I build up the eyes using a little bit of blue as well, just to give some highlight around the eyes, and just blend it so it's not all solid shapes. For the highlights I've just used the white hard pastel, just to bring out a bit of life into those tiger eyes. Next, I started to build the fur around the eyes, and this is a mix of brown, orange and white. And I just start using my darkest colours first, so in this case the dark brown pastel, and then working over the top of it with a slightly redder pastel, almost like a burnt umber colour. I blended it back a little bit and smudged it into the canvas, or into the wooden panel, and then worked over the top with an orange pastel. I repeated this until the whole area was covered. Just like I do with my paintings, I made sure to leave plenty of gaps between each stroke so that you could see the layers underneath. This helps to build that appearance of 3D realistic looking fur. Once I'd finished those layers, I put in some darker marks back into it with the black pastel, and then worked over the top with a final highlighted layer of yellow. Because I had very limited colours to choose from, I used the white pastel a little bit more than I usually would. Usually I don't like to use pure white, but it was the only lighter colour that I had access to. Usually if I was doing a pastel piece, I would be using light greys, or very pale yellows, or very pale reds, or very pale greens for those highlights, rather than the white by itself. I found that the pastels worked really well on the surface that I prepared using that golden primer, and I was really happy with how it started out. The only thing with this and pastel matte is you couldn't build up the layers as easily. Pastel matte is a much better surface, and I think if I was going to do another pastel piece, I would stick to using pastel matte paper just because I think it's one of the best surfaces to work on, especially with my technique and the way that I use the pastels. I'm not an expert on pastels though, and I haven't actually tried that many types of paper. I've used mount board, I've used cheap pastel paper, I've used my own boards that I've prepared like this, I've used canvases, and I think from all the ones that I've tried, Pastel Mat is the best. It holds onto the pastels really well, and it can take a lot of layers, and it doesn't break or warp, and it holds onto that pastel really well, so much so that you don't really even need to use fixative at the end when you've finished. It does still need to be framed behind glass, but it doesn't need to be fixed as it would do with other papers. I built up the nose of the tiger in very much the same way, starting with my darker colours and then working over the top with my lighter colours. For this one I'm using the Reeves pastels again, just these hard pastels, and making sure to leave plenty of gaps between each stroke so that you can see those colours underneath. I work over the top with the yellower colour, just to try and establish a little bit of light and a little bit of form on this tiger. It's really difficult to do this properly and really difficult to do this and have it look realistic because I have such a limited palette. Because I don't have many colours to work on, I can't really focus on the colours as much as I'd like to, and really one of the big things about making a realistic painting or drawing or pastel piece is making sure the colours that you use are as close to what you're seeing. If you can get those colours right and get those colours spot on, it will look more realistic than something that just has a lot of detail. So up to this point, I'm probably about an hour and a half into this painting, or pastel piece, whatever you want to call it, and this is where I started to really get into the flow. I started to understand how the pastels were working on the surface, and I really felt like I was speeding up with the process. Again, I'm just following that same process, working from dark to light, building up those colours on top of each other, but I familiarised myself with the surface. I learned a little bit more about the medium for this particular piece, which is why it's such a good idea to make sure that you're always practising and you're creating little sketches like these that will just help you develop as an artist and grow your talents, because realistically for me, this isn't a talent, this is a skill that I have put hours and hours and hours of work into, and I am nowhere close to being done with that. It's something that I'm going to practice for the rest of my life, and I don't think I will ever be at a stage that I'm happy with. I will always be trying to improve and get better, and I get better and improve by trying out different mediums, trying out different things and experimenting with surfaces just like I'm doing here. If you would like to learn more about how to paint a tiger, I have loads and loads of videos available that you can check out on my channel, so make sure to subscribe and go and check those out. I'll put a card up so you can see one specifically. This is a kind of in-depth video on how to paint a tiger, and it's actually a tiger that's in a very similar pose to this. That is just complete coincidence. But tigers are one of my favourite animals to paint, so I do have loads and loads of tigers and loads of tiger videos just because I love painting them so much. For the body, I started with the burnt umber pastel, worked over the top with black and the brown because I wanted this to be blended together and almost out of focus because I didn't want this to be the same level of detail as the rest of the face, so I just smudged it back with my finger. I then built the long wispy hairs over the top, and I actually used a blue pastel, or like a bluey lilac pastel, for the darker shadows. Because that was a white area of fur, I didn't want to use just a grey because that would have just sort of flattened the piece. I wanted to use colours that I was seeing in my reference photo, so I used quite a very vibrant blue for those shadows and then worked over the top to give that appearance of a cool shadow. Sometimes when you're painting white fur, it's really important to look for those saturated colours in your reference to give it a bit more of a realistic feel and make sure you're getting that form and 3D shape of the creature that you're trying to paint. So I'm pretty much finished with it now. I'm using the big stick for the whiskers. If I'd have had the right equipment and had all of my pastels with me, I definitely would have used pastel pencils a little bit more, and I definitely would have used pastel pencil for this step with the whiskers, because the chalk just gave a bit too chunky of a line, and I just thought it sort of ruined the picture a little bit. Not ruined it, but took away from the effect. What did actually ruin the picture was me spraying it with fixative. So yeah, don't spray it with fixative afterwards because it just completely took away all of the highlights, all of the details, and completely ruined this picture. I was experimenting with something new, experimenting with trying to create a pastel piece that didn't need to be framed behind glass, and I absolutely failed. I was using the Winsor & Newton fixative, and usually this works pretty well on pastel mats, but for this, with that golden pastel ground, it just completely washed away all of the details. So I don't know if you can see that, but yeah, here it is after I used the fixative, and it just completely washed away all of those colours. I also used a little bit of the Winsor & Newton glossy varnish spray over the top, and that completely destroyed it even more. I think what I am going to actually do to finish this off is treat this as an underpainting and work over the top with some acrylics next, just so it's not a completely wasted photo, and I actually think it will look better in acrylics anyway. But yeah, don't try this with your own work, and it just goes to show the importance of practicing and trying things first before doing these new things, because it's completely ruined this picture, wasted about 3 hours of my time, but at least I've learned something new and I know not to do this on a big piece. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It means so much to us. And as always, head over to studiowildlife.com for more wildlife art tips. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.